All right, last class we talked about going through and using square roots and factoring to find the solutions to our quadratic equation, or those points where it crosses the x-axis. But if you think about the answers that you were getting from when you did factoring and when you did square roots, there were probably a lot of whole numbers. And so the problem with that is very rarely do problems actually come out with whole numbers. And when we talk about things that make quadratic shapes, like shooting a basketball or throwing a t-shirt up into the air, those kinds of things are not going to land exactly on whole numbers every single time. So, when we talk about quadratics, we want to talk about other ways to solve them and that maybe don't have whole number answers. And for that, we're going to use quadratic formula. So, quadratic formula is something you're going to need to memorize. So, I've given you a couple of options here of songs to help you remember them. Um, Probably the middle one's my favorite, but you can use whichever one you want. And really, we're just looking to memorize the actual formula. Some of them have extra stuff on them, and that's fine. But you do need to memorize the quadratic formula and have that, kind of in the back of your mind every single time. All right, so let's talk about this. What the heck am I talking about when I say quadratic formula? So if you remember, we talked about that we had our quadratic equations where we had a number times x squared plus another number times x plus another number, and then it could be equal to 0. Sometimes our problems are not equal to 0, and so we're going to need to use adding or subtracting to make sure that we move all of the terms to the left side and get that equal to 0 if possible. So once it's equal to 0, then we can use quadratic formula to help us find all of the solutions, all of those x numbers where it's going to cross the x-axis. And we do that by using the quadratic formula, which is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so A, B, and C are going to be the numbers that are the coefficients of your x squared, your x term, and your constant term. And you're going to plug those numbers into the formula and then do those operations, adding, subtracting, multiplying, square rooting, etc., to help us figure out what the value of x is supposed to be. Good news, you're going to use your calculator for pretty much all of this once you know the formula. The question is, do you know the formula? So that's why we need to memorize it. Okay? So, as I reminded you, if you have a problem, the first thing we want to do is make sure it's equal to 0. So you can see in my example here, I started with 12n squared minus 10 equals 4n. That's not going to work very well with my quadratic formula. So I'm going to first get everything equal to 0 by subtracting 4n. And then I'm going to go through and figure out what my A and my B and my C are. Remember, A is in the front, B is the middle term, and then C is your last number. So in this particular problem, A is 12, B is negative 4, and C is negative 10. Then I take those numbers and I plug them in the right spots in that quadratic formula. So now my quadratic formula reads x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 12 times negative 10 all over 2 times 12. You can do that by hand if you want, but I think it's much easier to use your calculator. So if you pop on over here to this calculator work screen, let me just kind of show you what I typed in. First of all, I got a fraction. Remember to use that alpha y equals to get my fraction. I typed in everything that I wrote down, except instead of plus minus, you're just going to choose the plus sign for the first time. I'm going to put all my numbers in parentheses. That way it does all of the order of operations appropriately. If it's a squared term, it will actually do that squared and not the negative sign. If it's multiplying, it will multiply all the negative numbers together correctly. If you get an error when you're doing quadratic formula, it's probably because you didn't put all of your numbers in parentheses when you were typing them in. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to type in all my numbers with the plus sign, and then I'm going to hit enter. And that's going to give me one of my answers. So 1.09 is one of the points where that graph crosses the x-axis. Now, how do I get that second answer? Well, I'm going to do the same problem. I'm just going to use my minus sign instead of the plus sign. So go through, copy that problem down, and then use the minus sign. And when you plug all of that in, you'll get another answer at negative 0.76. Excuse me. So those are my two answers, x equals 1.09 and negative 0.761. So I got that from my calculator by typing all of that in my calculator with the plus sign once to get one answer and then the minus sign to get the second answer. So for a majority of the problems, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to write down the correct formula with the correct numbers in there, type that into your calculator, and then that should give you your answers right off the bat. So if you know the formula and you got all your things entered in your calculator right, these should be really easy problems for you. Okay. One of the other things we talk about when we talk about quadratic formula is the discriminant value. And the discriminant value is basically just what does the numbers underneath the square root from your quadratic formula end up being equal to. So my discriminant value would be if I went through and only did b squared minus 4ac. I didn't take the square root. I just typed in my calculator the b squared, sorry, the b squared minus 4ac amount, and that b squared minus 4ac amount would be a number. Do not take your square root. That number could be the answer they're looking for. If they ask you what is the discriminant, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for a number answer. But it also can tell you how many solutions you're going to have. So when you get a discriminant problem, you have to make sure that you're answering the right question. Do they want the value or do they want to know how many solutions? Okay, so getting the value, you would type that in your calculator. If they want to know how many solutions, you have to take it a step further and think about what kind of number is that value that you got for your discriminant. So if you go through and you get b squared minus 4ac is a positive number, then that means there's going to be two solutions, or that graph is going to cross the x-axis 2 times. That's what that b squared minus 4ac positive number tells you. If you do b squared minus 4ac and you get 0, that means there's only one solution, or that graph only crosses the x-axis one time. And if you get b squared minus 4ac equal to a negative number, then we're going to be trying to take the square root of a negative number, which for us is not good. So that's going to be no solution. And that means that your graph never crosses the x-axis. So again, when you're doing the discriminant problems, you need to think about, do they want just the number or the value, or do they want to know how many solutions there's going to be? Okay, and you're going to type that part in your calculator too. B squared minus 4ac, again, with your parentheses and everything. Don't make that overly complicated. Okay, so just a couple of things to remember when you're doing quadratic formula problems or discriminant problems. I said all these a couple of times already, but the first one is make sure your equation is equal to 0 before you do quadratic formula, or you're going to have the wrong ABC numbers. Make sure you put all your ABC values in parentheses when you type them in your calculator so that you get the right values. And then your discriminant can either ask you for a value or they might ask you for how many solutions, so be careful with that. If you take a look below this, there's a maze practice if you want to do that. Start at start, go through, do your quadratic formula, follow the path, etc. And if you want to just do regular practice problems, then there's some just regular practice down here too. Both the maze and the practice have answers attached to them, so you're able to go through and check your work to see how you're doing. Okay? If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.